Hi class and welcome to chapter 7, the axial skeleton. We're going to be going through the bones in the skeleton, and please use these PowerPoints as you're studying for your lab exam, but you might also see some kind of labeling of bones on your lecture exam as well. So use chapter 7 and 8 as a study tool for your lab practicum to master list, and I'll try to go through as much detail as I can here. So the skeleton consists of your bones, cartilage, joints, and ligaments. Joints can also be called articulations, and you have 206 named bones that are grouped into two divisions. The axial skeleton, which is about 80 bones, that consists of the skull, vertebral column, and thoracic cage. And the appendicular skeleton consists about of 126 bones, and that is your upper and lower limbs, which we'll be going over in the next video in chapter 8. So here's the human skeleton, and the axial skeleton is what is highlighted here: the skull, thoracic cage, vertebral column, the sacrum and coccyx, as well as the sternum. So you can see all the bones of the axial skeleton labeled here. Here's a posterior view of the axial skeleton. It consists of all the bones of the skull, which is a little tricky, and then the thoracic cage, vertebral column is a little bit easier to grasp. So we'll start with the skull. It's the body's most complex bony structure, as you guys will be well aware of. It's formed by cranial and facial bones, and the bones of the cranium enclose and protect the brain, and these provide the attachment sites for some muscles of the head and the neck. The facial bones form the framework of the face. They form cavities for sense organs of your sight, taste, and smell, like your eyeballs, your ears. The facial bones provide openings for passage of air and food. Your facial bones hold your teeth in place, and they anchor muscles of the face that are used for facial expression. So here are the bones of the cranium versus the facial bones. So you can see here how we separate them out. Again, the bones of the cranium have the cerebrum inside, and the facial bones are more on the front part aspect of the face. The facial bones form the anterior aspect, and the cranium is divided into a cranial vault and the base. Internally, prominent bony ridges divide the skull into distinct fossa, anterior, middle, and posterior, and the brain will sit within the cranial fossa, and it occupies that cranial cavity. So here's a look at the anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa or depression, where the cerebrum or the brain will sit and occupy those spaces. Here we see the different lobes of the brain and where these lobes occupy those different cranial fossa. So the cerebellum occupies the posterior cranial fossa, the temporal lobe occupies the middle cranial fossa, and the frontal lobe of your cerebrum occupies that anterior cranial fossa. The skull contains smaller cavities, so you have the middle and inner ear cavities in the lateral aspect of the cranial base. The nasal cavity lies in and posterior to the nose. The orbits house your eyeballs, and the paranasal sinuses occur in several bones around the nasal cavity. The skull contains about 85 named openings. We will not be learning all of them, but many of them. These openings are called foramina, canals, and fissures, and these provide openings for important structures like your spinal cord, blood vessels serving the brain, and 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The cranial bones are formed from 8 large bones. You have paired bones, including the temporal and parietal bones, and then the unpaired bones are the frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid. Paired bones mean you have 2 of them, and unpaired bones meaning you have 1. The parietal bones form the superior and lateral parts of the skull, and you have sutures are where you have 4 sutures of the cranium, and these are where your skull bones join together and fuse together. The coronal suture runs in the coronal plane. It's located where your parietal bones meet your frontal bone. The squamous suture occurs where each parietal bone meets the temporal bone inferiorly. The sagittal suture occurs where the right and left parietal bones meet superiorly, and the lambdoid suture occurs where the parietal bones meet the occipital bone posteriorly. These sutural bones are small bones that occur within the sutures. They're irregular in shape, and not all people have sutural bones. But here is just a brief look at where these sutures are located. And again, a suture is just kind of a joining of skull bones that fuse together within 1 year of age. Here's your frontal bone, parietal bones, occipital bone in the back, temporal bone on the sides where your ears are. And then we have the sphenoid bone, the exterior surface of the sphenoid bone that you can see. The zygomatic bone are your cheekbones, maxilla, nasal, lacrimal bone. A lot of these help to make the orbit where your eyeball will sit. And then we have the mandible, which is your jaw bone, and that's the only movable bone in the skull. And you can see here the alveolar processes are where the teeth will kind of fuse in with these bones. So these are all good pictures that you're going to be spending a lot of time with studying. We can also start to see openings. The external acoustic meatus is where your ear canal will be. Styloid process, mastoid process, the condylar process of the mandoid, how it sits and fits in with the temporal bone, the coronoid process. We have the mandibular ramus, the mandibular angle, and then we have a mental foramen shown here. Every time you see a little tiny hole, it usually has a name and something is going through it. So this is an artist rendition. It's kind of nice to see the different colors of the bones separated out. And then this is what a skull, a photograph of the right side of the skull would actually look like. So you can still see the sutures where bones come and are fused together. You can also see the holes very easily, but if it's easier to study a picture of this, I will test you and quiz you on both types of pictures, actual bone pictures, or I might use some pictures that are colored as well. The frontal bone forms the forehead. You have a supraorbital margin, which is the superior margin of the orbits. The supraorbital foramen is passage for the supraorbital nerve and artery. The glabella is the smooth part of the frontal bone between the arches. The frontal sinuses are within the frontal bone, and internally, the frontal bone contributes to the anterior cranial fossa. So here's an anterior view of the skull. Again, as you use your lab practicum list, use that as a checklist and then check off each thing on the checklist that you're responsible for. So there might be things that you see in a picture that you don't have to know for lab. So again, use that lab practicum 2 master list as a checklist to make sure you can identify all parts of the skull, all the holes. You can see infraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen, the different fissures, the different parts of the ethmoid bone, the middle concha, perpendicular plate. Here's your vomer, which is an unpaired bone that makes up the bottom part of the nasal septum. You see your mental foramens here, and then the mental protuberance is just another word for the chin. Here's another look, a photo of the anterior view of the skull from an actual skull without colors shown. The occipital bone forms the posterior portion. It articulates with your temporal and parietal bones, and it forms the posterior cranial fossa. The foramen magnum is located at its base, which is a large hole that your spinal cord will go through. And here are different features and structures of the occipital bone. There are condyles, the hypoglossal foramen, the external occipital protuberance, which you can feel on the back of your skull, and then the superior and inferior nuchal lines, which is what different muscles will attach to. So here's a look at the occipital bones, the different features of the occipital bone, the Sphenoid suture that connects the occipital bone to the parietal bone. And this is a good look at the sagittal suture where the 2 parietal bones come together. Here's an inferior aspect of the skull. You could see the foramen magnum, which is what your spinal cord will go through. The occipital condyles, which is what your skull sits on. It articulates with the vertebral column. And you see a lot of other fun stuff here that we'll get through. You see your hard palate, which is made up of the maxilla and the palatine bone. You see more holes shown here, the jugular foramen, external acoustic meatus, the foramen ovale. We'll get through a lot of these holes, but use pictures like this as you're studying the practicum lists. The temporal bones lie inferior to your parietal bones. They form around the ear, and they form the inferior lateral portion of the skull. The term temporal comes from the Latin word for time. In the specific parts of the temporal bone, you have a squamous, tympanic, and petrous portion. The mastoid process is the site for neck muscle attachment. The petrous part projects medially, and it contributes to the cranial base. And this is where your middle and internal ear will be housed. And we'll get to that a little more when we get to your special senses. The temporal bone contributes to the middle and posterior cranial fossa. And then we have different foramina and holes in the temporal bone. The jugular foramen is actually a hole formed with the boundary of the occipital bone. You don't need to know what goes through all of these holes, but you do need to be able to label the holes. The carotid canal, the foramen lacerum, and the internal acoustic meatus. So here's a look at the temporal bone and shown where it would lie in the skull. The squamous is the flat part. You can see some of these holes labeled styloid process, mastoid process, and then the petrous will be the more rocky or bony part. The sphenoid bone spans the width of the cranial floor. It looks like a bat or a butterfly with its wings spread. It consists of a body and 3 pairs of processes, and it contains 5 important openings. We call it the keystone of the cranium. Some important landmarks, and I'll try to underline things I want you to know. The sella turcica houses the pituitary gland, the sphenoidal sinuses, and then it has greater, lesser wings and pterygoid processes. Here are different important openings of the sphenoid bone: the optic canal, superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, ovale, and spinosum. They make an ROS type arrangement to help you learn them. And here's a look at the sphenoid bone. You can see the lesser and greater wings and how that resembles a bat or a butterfly. The sella turcica is where your sphenoid bone sits. And then we have different holes. And the holes that you can see well here are the rotundum, which is shaped like a circle. The foramen ovale is more oval shaped, and the foramen spinosum is at the bottom. So to remember these, I do rotundum is your R hole, ovale is your O hole, and then the S hole. So ROS to help you remember those holes in order. Here's a look at the pterygoid processes, which are like the legs of the bone or the bat. Here's the superior orbital fissure, which is a slit between the lesser and greater wings. So you can see the slit right there. And I think those are all you can see. The last thing I want to point out is the optic canal, which is within the lesser wing. The ethmoid bone lies between your nasal and sphenoid bones. It forms most of the medial bony region between the nasal cavity and the orbits. And it's made of these important structures. The cribriform plate is the superior surface, and your cribriform plate contains little tiny holes called cribriform foramina, which is what your olfactory nerves will travel down into your nasal cavity to be able to smell. The crista galli is an attachment place for the falx cerebri, which is a ligament within the cerebrum. And then the perpendicular plate forms the superior part of the nasal septum. The ethmoidal labyrinth contains air cells, and the ethmoid bone contains your superior and middle nasal conchae, which extend medial to form lateral masses within the bones. So here's a look at the ethmoid bone. Here's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Here are sphenoidal sinuses spaces. So this is just a look at a mid-sagittal section showing the internal anatomy of the left half of the skull. Here's the ethmoid bone. Here's the middle concha, the perpendicular plate, and the crista galli, which sticks up from the cribriform plate with cribriform foramina. The facial bones, the only unpaired facial bones, which means there's only one of them, are your mandible and your vomer. And paired bones mean you have 2 of them, so they're paired. So these are all facial bones. Here's the anterior view of the skull and where all those facial bones are located. So use that as you're studying. The lateral aspect of the skull where these facial bones are located. The mandible is the lower jawbone. It's the largest, strongest facial bone. It's the only movable bone of the skull, and it's composed of a horizontal body and 2 upright rami, or ramus for singular. And here are the major landmarks in the mandible. You have a fossa, mandibular foramen, alveolar processes, mental foramen, condylar processes, and ramus. So these are the detailed anatomy of the mandible and the maxilla. And you can see here how this makes the temporomandibular joint. The mandibular fossa of the temporal bone connects to the mandibular condyle. And that makes a joint which allows you to move and chew your food. The maxillary bones articulate with all other facial bones except the mandible. They contain maxillary sinuses or spaces. They form part of the inferior orbital fissure, and they are the keystone bones of the face. So here's a look at the maxilla. You have two maxilla that come together and form right underneath the nose where they join together. Here's the orbital surface where the eye will sit within, the infraorbital foramen. Again, you have different blood vessels and nerves traveling through there. And then the alveolar processes that attach to the upper row of your teeth. So again, bringing it all together, here's an inferior aspect of the skull. Again, use this PowerPoint to study. Your lab manual is good as well. Here are other bones of the face. You have two zygomatic bones, which are your cheekbones, two nasal bones forming the bridge of your nose, two lacrimal bones, two palatine bones, which form the posterior part of the hard phalate. You have one vomer bone, and I just want to make sure these are all paired bones. Look good. One vomer bone, and you have two inferior nasal concha, which are thin curved bones that project medially to form the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Special parts of the skull, you have a nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, orbits where your eyes will sit, and the hyoid bone. So here are the bones of the nasal cavity and what makes up the nasal cavity. You can see here a sagittal view of the nasal cavity and what makes up the nasal cavity itself. Paranasal sinuses are air-filled sinuses. They lighten the skull. They're lined with mucous membrane. And these are the different sinuses and the bones that they lie in. Here are the paranasal sinuses, and you can see them here, spaces within the skull to help lighten the skull. Bones that form the orbit are shown here. So you have your sphenoid bone, frontal bone, zygomatic bone, infraorbital bone, lacrimal bone. So different bones that help. The ethmoid bone sneaks in there. So different bones that form the orbit. And then the hyoid bone lies inferior to the mandible. It's the only bone with no direct articulation with any other bone, and it acts as a movable base for the tongue. So here's your hyoid bone. It's kind of free floating, but it's attached to different muscles and tissues right underneath the mandible. The vertebral column then is formed from 26 bones, and it transmits weight of the trunk to the lower limbs. It surrounds and protects the spinal cord, and it serves as an attachment for muscles of the neck and the back. So here's the vertebral column. You have 7 cervical vertebrae, which make up the cervical curvature. So we kind of have this curvature of the spine. The curvature of the spine is necessary to help withstand the weight of the upper limbs. The thoracic curvature is made up of 12 thoracic vertebra. The lumbar curvature is made up of 5 lumbar vertebra. You have the sacral curvature and then the coccyx. The vertebral column has these 5 major regions, which are shown in the previous pages. An easy way to remember it of how many vertebrae are in each region is you eat breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5, or supper at 5. So that's how many vertebrae make up each section of the vertebral column. The sacrum and coccyx are all fused together, but they're fused from 5 bones in the sacrum. The coccyx is just inferior to that. The curvatures of the spine, we have cervical and thoracic and lumbar and sacral curvatures, which you saw on that previous slide. The curvatures increase resilience of the spine. Primary curvatures are present at birth, and then secondary curvatures develop when your baby begins to walk as it's trying to support the upper limbs on the vertebral column. The ligaments of the spine, you have different ligaments that help to support, prevent hyperextension of the spine. They attach to intervertebral discs. So these are ligaments of the spine to also provide support. And these ligaments are seen here. The ligaments travel between vertebra of the vertebral column to provide support and prevent your spine from hyperextending itself. So here is the anterior view of part of the spinal column with that anterior longitudinal ligament. The intervertebral discs are cushion-like pads. They're composed of the nucleus pulposus and the annulus fibrosus, which is made up of fibrous cartilage. The nucleus pulposus is more gelatin, jelly-like, and then the annulus fibrosus is made up of fibrocartilage. So here's a great animation of the rotating spine. To get to these animations, you just need to download the PowerPoints and then you can watch them. Here's a structure of a typical vertebra. Again, you need to know these for lecture and lab. The spinous process is what you can feel if you run your finger down the length of your spine. Transverse processes go out parallel. Here's the body, which is what your intervertebral discs will sit on. There's a vertebral foramen, and this is what your spinal cord travels through. And then you have the lamina. The lamina kind of makes up the kind of the walls leading up to the spinous process. And the pedicles connect this kind of posterior part of the vertebral column. The two pedicles connect that part to the body, the anterior part of the vertebra. Here are the common structures to all regions of a typical vertebra, which you guys should be really familiar with. Specific regions of the spine perform specific functions, and the types of movement that can occur between vertebra are flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation along the long axis. You have 7 cervical vertebrae. They're the smallest and lightest. The spinous processes are short and bifid, which means they're split. And we'll show you a picture of a typical cervical vertebra. The vertebral foramen are large, triangular. The transverse processes of a cervical vertebra contain holes called transverse foramina, and the superior articular facets face superior posteriorly. So here's a look at a typical cervical vertebra, and the main differences of a cervical vertebra is you have this bifid spinous process that's split, and you have these transverse foramina, which are holes in the transverse processes, and the spinous process is a little angled down. So this is a typical cervical vertebra. Here is C1 and C2 are the atlas and axis, and they will make a connection that allows your head to shake no. But these are the 7 cervical vertebra. The vertebral prominence of C7, the spinous process is very, it sticks out a lot. So if you feel down in your neck, and look down, you can feel your C7 spinous process sticking out. C1 is the atlas. It lacks a body and a spinous process. It supports the skull, and it allows flexion and extension to allow you to nod your head yes. So this is C1. It looks special, the first cervical vertebra, no body, no spinous process. The axis is C2. It has a body and a spinous process. It has a dens, which looks like a thumbs up sign, and helps to rotate and pivot the atlas to the skull, and this allows you to shake your head no. So this is the axis, C2. This is the dens, which kind of looks like a thumbs up if we look at it from the side. So that's C2, the axis. Thoracic vertebrae, you have 12 of them. They all touch your ribs. They have a heart-shaped body. They all have a facet or a connection piece with a rib. And this is a typical kind of look at what a thoracic vertebra looks like. And you should spend time labeling and knowing where all parts of the thoracic vertebra are labeled. Their spinous processes are long and point down. The vertebral foramen is more circular. The inferior and superior articular facets will connect with other ribs above and below them, which allow for rotation but limits flexion and extension. And then the lumbar vertebra, you have 5 of them. They are very thick and robust. They allow for flexion and extension, but rotation is permitted. And here's what a typical lumbar vertebra looks like. So you should be able to know the differences and characteristics between all 3 types of vertebra. You can see they're much thicker in shape, and the intervertebral discs will sit between them like all vertebrae. The sacrum then shapes the posterior wall of the pelvis. It's formed from 5 fused vertebrae. We have a sacral promontory where the first sacral vertebra will bulge out. The center of gravity is 1 centimeter posterior to that sacral promontory, so it acts as a good kind of stabilizer where all the weight will sit on. The ala refers to is developed from the fused rib elements. The sacral foramina are holes where sacral nerves will go through, whether that's anterior or posterior. And here's a look at the sacrum, and then the coccyx is the tailbone below that. The coccyx is the tailbone. It's formed from about 3 to 5 fused vertebrae. It offers only slight support to your pelvic organs. And then we get to the thoracic cage, which forms the framework of your chest. It contains your thoracic vertebra in the back, the ribs on the sides, and the sternum and costal cartilage on the front. It protects your thoracic organs, and it supports the shoulder girdle and your upper limbs. And it also provides attachment sites for many muscles of the back. So here's a look at the thoracic cage and how everything comes together to support and protect the organs within it. Here's a radiograph of the thorax, a chest x-ray. The sternum is formed from 3 sections. The manubrium is the upper section where you have clavicular notches, which will touch the clavicles. The body is the bulk of the sternum, where the sides will have notched articulations for costal cartilage of ribs 2 to 7. And then the xiphoid process is in the inferior end of the sternum. This will ossify around age 40. The xiphoid process is where you want to place your 30 compressions for CPR. The sternum has a jugular notch, it's a central indentation, a sternal angle, and then another joint where the sternal body and the xiphoid process will fuse together. And then we have ribs. We have true and false ribs. True ribs are the superior 7 ribs. They are attached to the sternum by costal cartilage. So though you have 7 true ribs, and they're true because they're attached to the sternum by costal cartilage. And then you have 5 pairs of false ribs because they're not attached directly to the sternum. And actually ribs 11 and 12 are known as floating ribs because they are not attached at all. So here's a look at a rib anatomical structure: the head of the rib, the neck, the articular facet of the tubercle, the costal groove, which is where you'll have a costal artery lie, and then the junction with the costal cartilage. This is how the ribs attach to the vertebra and how everything comes together. So you can see here the head, the neck, and the tubercle of rib will all fit in with the vertebra on the posterior aspect of the vertebral column. And then the costal cartilage of the rib in the front will attach to the sternum. Here's a look how the ligaments will help the ribs attach to the thoracic vertebra. You can have disorders of the axial skeleton. A cleft palate is a common congenital disorder. Stenosis, where a right and left halves of the palate fail to fuse. Stenosis of the lumbar spine is narrowing of the vertebral canal that can compress the roots of spinal nerves. Abnormal spinal curvature, scoliosis, is an abnormal lateral curvature where your curvature, instead of going vertical, your spine will kind of curve off to the side. Kyphosis is an exaggerated thoracic curvature, and lordosis is an extenuated lumbar curvature, giving a sway back. The axial skeleton throughout life, the membrane bones will begin to ossify in the 2nd month of development. Your bone tissue grows outward from ossification centers, and fontanelles are unossified remnants of membranes. So here's our fontanelles, or soft spots within the skull of a newborn. The anterior fontanelles at the top before your frontal bones ossify with the parietal bones, and you have a posterior fontanelle in the back. So this is why you never want to drop a baby on their skull within the 1st year until these fontanelles have fused together and your skulls of the baby has completely fused together with those sutures. So here is a look at where other fontanelles are located, or soft spots in the skull of a newborn. The axial skeleton throughout life, many bones of the face and skull form from intramembranous ossification, but endochondral bones of the skull will form from endochondral ossification from those cartilage, hyaline cartilage models, and those are shown there. The aging of the axial skeleton, water content of your intervertebral discs tend to decrease. By age 55, a loss of a few centimeters in height is common. The thorax can become more rigid and the bones will lose mass with age, sometimes leading to osteoporosis and other kind of brittle bones that can break a lot more easily. This is chapter 7. Thanks for listening, guys. We will do chapter 8 in the next video, which will be the appendicular skeleton.